This is Kathy from Gadgets Top 321, and in today's video I'm going to be taking a look at Sailor Ink Studio 143. I'll do a writing sample on Tomoe River paper using a variety of pens and nib sizes ranging from a Pilot Extra Fine to a 1.5 stub. I'll take a look at a writing sample that I did on 20-pound copy paper. Then I'll compare 143 to similar inks from my collection. And finally, I'll show the results of my water resistance test. I have to give a disclaimer for this video. The color of 143 is showing up much brighter than it does in real life. It's looking like a bright sky blue when in real life it looks a little more like a stormy cloud blue. I'm seeing in this ink swatch here, the center of it is a bit more lavender than it's showing up. So in this video you'll be able to see how the ink performs on paper and how it feels in the different nib sizes. But if you're thinking about getting this ink, I encourage you to look at other pictures. The first writing sample was done with a glass dip pen, and the ink came off the nib decently well. It felt a little dry, but it's nice and legible and was decently pleasant to write with. The swatch was done with tweezers that were pinched together and dipped in the ink, and the ink came off the tweezers nice and uniformly. It didn't have any trouble grabbing the paper, and there's a nice range from a medium saturation down to very light, so it shows a nice possibility for some shading. I'm going to begin with a Pilot 78G Plus with an extra fine nib. First impressions are very nice. It feels nice in this extra fine nib. It's not scratchy at all. My only concern is kind of like with the dip pen up here. Some of the letters are much lighter, some are darker, and so that affects the legibility with this extra fine. But as far as how it feels writing, it feels nice. And you can see here the N looks, the legibility of the N is very nice, but as you get to the end of the word, the E is a little bit faint. Next, I have a Sailor Pro Gear Slim with a fine 14 karat nib. This feels a bit drier than the Pilot did. And it's a bit more legible, but I'm still seeing those areas where it just feels like it's a bit too light. And I don't know if you'll be able to see this. I think you can. On the ink smear, I'm seeing the lavender X, and the blue is what smears away. That's kind of interesting. It felt, I'm going to say it feels a bit dry. Oh, and feels dry. There is a nice bit of ink being laid down, but it's just so watery it doesn't provide you that cushion. Next is a Sailor 1911 with a 14 karat medium nib. I have high hopes for this one. This does feel much smoother. And I like how it's laying the ink down. I'm not seeing those areas that are lighter. Yeah, it's applying the ink more uniformly, but I'm still seeing a bit of shading. I am going to say this is nice. Exclamation point. It's going to be difficult to beat that writing experience. Next is a Pilot Custom 74 with a 14 karat fine nib. Now this is smoother than the Sailor fine nib. but it does still feel a bit dry compared to how typical inks feel in this pilot nib. I'm going to say it is nice. It doesn't feel dry like the Sailor fine nib, but I still prefer the Sailor medium nib, I believe. Next is a Twisby Mini with a fine stainless steel nib. This Twisby nib does run a little dry, and yeah, I can feel it. It does feel a bit dry. I do like it better than the Sailor Pro Gear Slim though, but it does run a little bit wider. It looks more like the Sailor 1911 medium. But it feels drier than the Sailor nib did. Let's see. It doesn't look well, it looks just a bit drier. I am going to put that it feels dry, but it's okay. Next is a Pilot Metropolitan with a cursive medium nib. Oh, this feels nice. You never know with this Pilot Metropolitan. It's nice and smooth. A little bit dry, but I don't feel the dryness. Next is a Quebeco Lily put with a stainless steel double broad nib. This isn't scratchy or anything, but it feels dry. It feels like you're writing with a pen that has no ink in it. I can't feel the ink on the paper. So that's a bit unusual for this nib. I'm going to put feels dry. And it looks kind of dry. You can see some areas look pretty pale. Finally, I've got a Jinhao X750 with a stainless steel 1.5 stub replacement nib. Now normally with this nib, the inks feel very luxurious and satisfying. We'll see with this one. Well, I'm surprised. I thought it was going to feel dry like the Quebeco did. It doesn't feel dry. Yeah, it's not super wet like you see sometimes with this nib, but the ink is grabbing the paper just fine. Sometimes with this stub nib and some inks, I have trouble with the ink not wanting to grab the paper, but this one did okay. And I'm seeing some shading already. While that dries, let's take a look at the writing sample on 20-pound copy paper. Each of the pens felt nice for the most part. Even the extra fine, I would say the extra fine was more legible on the copy paper, and it felt nice to write with. That was a surprise, and it's unusual. I had nice exclamation point by the Sailor 1911 medium nib, but after the ink has dried, I'm seeing some feathering. It was very pleasant while I was writing, but now that the ink has dried, I think I prefer the Twisby Mini or the Pro Gear Slim Fine. Either of those were pleasant enough to write with, and they look a little better after it's dried. The Pilot Custom 74, I'm not seeing as much feathering with it, but just the nature of the way that nib puts ink on the paper, it's looking a little blobby. Like you're seeing areas where It's put down much more ink where the ink just kind of blobbed on the paper. So it felt a little too wet, but you know, it wasn't horrible. It was pleasant enough to write with. The ink bled through with most of the nibs, but it's a pale enough ink that it doesn't look terrible. But with 20-pound copy paper, you're not likely going to be writing on both sides anyway. Sailor Ink Studio 143 is one of those unusual chromo-shading inks. It's not as apparent in this video as it is in person, but some similar inks that I have were Sailor Manyo Haha, which is very similar but just a bit more pale, but the component colors look very similar to 143. Sailor Ink Studio 224 is another one of those chromo shading inks, but is a bit more lavender, or maybe even leans a little more toward being a powdery pink. Sailor Ink Studio 123 is more similar to 224. It's more of that powdery pink or lavender color. And finally, Ferris Wheel Press Cotton Candy. This 143 is the ink I was looking for, the behavior I was looking for when I ordered the sample of cotton candy. Sailor Ink Studio 143, for all practical purposes, has no water resistance. There's a ghost of some of the writing, but almost all of it has washed away. And back to the Tomoe River writing sample. No bleed through, but a bit more show through than I was expecting with this pale colored ink. On good paper, I have to say, the Sailor Medium nib is my favorite. I like how just the way the Sailor Medium nib applies the ink to the paper, it spreads it out. It's not blobby like the Pilot fine nib, and it's not as dry as the Sailor fine nib. It's just a good fit for this type of ink. And I have to say that Platinum's medium nibs tend to behave the same with these type of inks. So a Sailor or a Platinum medium nib for me is a good fit for this ink. Now, depending on what papers you use, you may or may not get that halo effect that I don't know if it's going to show up. It may be a bit more apparent here. In the scribble where it's laid down some ink kind of heavily, there's like a halo of the blue, and inside the pen strokes is the lavender color. Now, in person, that makes this ink come out a little more of a periwinkle color, or to me, it's like a storm cloud blue color. It's a very interesting color, so I encourage you to look at other pictures of this ink from other sources if you're considering it. If you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.